Welcome to the video. This is a video for the OpenTX mix school, and what we've done in the past is done loads of different mixes of how you set up things on the Throttles and OpenTX, and what we get occasionally are some really interesting questions, and this one has come from a gentleman called Adam Sparrow. So Adam, thank you for the request. And what Adam is trying to do is he's trying to set it up so that he can take off with the throttle controlled by a slider, and then once he increases the throttle above a certain point, that then becomes the primary throttle control, and the radio forgets about the slider for throttle altogether. Now, he's been trying to do this and having a bit of a problem, so I thought it would be an interesting one to go through. Now, for those of you that have not seen any of the other Throttles or OpenTX videos, this one is going to be a little bit complicated. It's more for those who've had the radio for a while, who are a little bit more used to programming and setting it up. We have a great series where we actually go through all the Throttles and OpenTX pieces and a lot more of the basic mix settings for things like ailerons, flaperons, crow, setting up the basics. We're going to use quite a few things here in order to get what Adam's after. So first of all, let me demo how this is going to work. So we have one set up here that's actually all ready to go. If I open it up and I simulate the radio, the way we have it set here is that anything below 80% on the throttle is going to allow the slider to work. So here in the simulator, we are in what I've called takeoff mode, and then in the outputs, the throttle is channel 3. I can control the throttle with the slider, and the main throttle doesn't do anything at all. So the way it would work is I would have the start with the throttle down here, probably the throttle down there as well, and we would take off, and once we're taking off, then we'd say, right, okay, I'm happy, and then I will pick this up, we'd increase the main throttle. Once it gets over a certain point, you'll see logical switches coming on, and now the throttle controls everything, and even if we go below that level, we never get to the point that the throttle's controlled by that initial slider. That's now turned off and we have full control on the throttle. So that's what we're going to set up. So sit back, get yourself a fresh cup of coffee. This one is going to take a little bit of time because there's a few steps. So let's create a new model from scratch. We'll call it demo. Let's go through and accept all of the basics, and then we'll start. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to add another input into the demo. At the moment the standard 4 inputs are here. We're going to just add another one. You know, I always like to add the inputs in here, so we're going to call it something like THRS, and we'll say the source is that slider. There we go. So that's that one working out. On the outputs, on the mixes, we have rudder, elevator and throttle. We haven't got ailerons on this one. We didn't put them on as part of the setup, but that makes it just as easy here. So what we can do is we say with throttle, we're going to add a new line. And this new line we'll call THR slider. The source is going to be that slider we've just set up. There we have it. Now, we can switch between these two by using a switch on the radio. So rather than me go through all the steps in between, let me just explain the individual pieces. So we could switch between the throttle either coming from that control or that control by simply assigning it to a switch. So as I could say, when switch A is in the back position, the main throttle's working. When switch A is in the middle position, here we go, it's coming from there. So the way it works, we simulate that. Switch A is at the top, which means the throttle is controlled by the throttle stick, unless switch A is in the middle position, in which case it's controlled by a slider. So that's the basic mechanism that you can use. However, the problem is that even when we start playing with logical switches, we're going to get in trouble. So what we want to do is set up a logical switch that's going to make that happen automatically as the throttle gets above a certain value. So rather than flicking a switch, SA in this value, we're going to set up a logical switch that will be turned on by the throttle automatically. So we're going to say when the throttle is above a certain value, we'll say that value is going to be something. We'll make it quite high because the simulator in this thing always puts the throttle in the middle, which is a bit of a bug, but we'll say when it's above 80%, so when the throttle gets to the top, it'll take on. Last thing, of course, we need to set which channel we're after, which is throttle. So if I click on simulate, then as the throttle goes above 80%, you'll see the logical 1 switch turn on. So there we are. We could use that to churn between the two. So if I went back then and said that on my mixes, rather than SA, we'll use the logical switch, which is logical switch 1. If I can find it, there we are. So when it's on, it works that way, and when logical switch negative, when it's not on, it works that way. We could use that logical switch to change between the two. The problem is though, is that logical switch 1 is going on and off. You see that on the side? So unfortunately, as I go above the level, that's brilliant. We now have control of the throttle via the control. The slide doesn't do anything, but as soon as I bring it back down, this is the problem that Adam's having, then it goes back there. So what we want is something that's going to be sticky, that's going to be a logical switch that's going to stay on, that we can use to move things around. Now we can do that very easily. Go back to logical switches. We can say we want a sticky, and the source is going to be L1. Okay, and if we jump back into simulate, so now when L1 comes on, L2 will come on and stay on. So here we are, the throttle's not working, we have the slider at the side working the throttle, and then as we come up to a certain point, logical switch 1 will come on, logical switch 2 will come on, and then as I drop the throttle again, logical 1 goes off, but logical 2 stays on. Oh, well, that doesn't really help us. The trick with this is, now we've got this far, is we can use flight modes. Now flight modes are one of those things that lots of people don't use, but they are absolutely brilliant. The reason that flight modes are so cool is if we look in our mixes again, we can see here that you can actually decide which flight modes the lines are working on. So we could easily say in here that we only want the normal throttle to work in one particular mode and the slider throttle to work in another, and use logical switch 2, which is that sticky switch, to split between them. So let me just show you what I mean. So what we're going to do is we're going to set flight modes. We'll set flight mode, which is normal, and call it something like takeoff. So that's the one that it's in if nothing is changed. Flight mode 1, the switch that we're going to use to turn that on and off, is that sticky switch we made, which is L2, and we'll call this something like normal flight. Or just do normal, we haven't got enough things. Now we could use the fade in and out in order to fade the values between mode 1 and mode 2, so that if we didn't want a sharp snap between the two values, we could use that. And watch my other videos on flight modes for how that works. So now if we go into the mixes, let's forget about all this logical switch nonsense. Let's get rid of all that. We're not going to use a switch here. What we're going to use is the power of the mode. So we're going to say that this one that we're looking at here, which is the throttle, the main throttle, works in everything apart from takeoff mode, which is mode 0. And we're going to say in here, get rid of the switch again, we don't need to bother about that, we're not using switches. We're going to say that this only works in flight mode 0. So let's have a look at what that looks like. Click on simulate again. Here we're actually in takeoff mode, and the throttle is controlled by the slider on the left. And again, as we increase the throttle past the threshold, logical switch 1 will click on, which will stick logical switch 2 on. And now we're actually in normal mode, but now because logical switch 2 is on all the time and going to keep us in that mode, as I move the throttle back down, it's going to be fine, and that slider at the side is never going to come back into play. So that is the trick. The trick here is to use the combination and power of a logical switch that first of all shows when you're above a certain threshold. In reality, you're probably going to have this something like -50 or -60. Unfortunately, I can't use that with the demo on the simulator here because the stick always starts in the middle. Once that turns on, it actually sticks on logical switch 2. That's a sticky switch that stays on there forever. That then is the one that flicks us between flight mode 0 and flight mode 1. And again, we can use the fade in and out to have a slightly more subtle change between those two, which will help with changing the throttle position. And then on the mixes, we say that the normal throttle works in all flight modes apart from takeoff mode, and the slider throttle that's set up only works in takeoff mode. So that's a little bit complicated, a little bit convoluted, but hopefully what that's shown you is in OpenTX, if you can think of it, there's probably a way to do it. So Adam, hopefully that helps the question that you had. If anyone has an idea or a request for an OpenTX mix, then pop it in and we'll consider it for a future video. Thank you for taking the time to watch that video. There are lots of other videos on the channel and they're carefully ordered into playlists, so you may find that there are other videos on this same subject that you can go and watch. So I would recommend going into the playlist area of Painless 360 YouTube channel and looking around and seeing what there is. You never know what you might find. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and happy flying.